Okay, so today we're going to cut through today's extremely thick winter gloom with a closer look at a new loudspeaker from Wharfedale. It's called the Super Linton, and it's a souped up version of the extremely popular Linton. And I believe, or so Wharfedale have told me, that the Linton, the original Linton from 2019? Well, it's not the original, is it? Because that's a remake of a speaker from the 60s and 70s. But the remade Linton from 2019 is apparently Wharfedale's best-selling speaker by quite some way of the modern era. And we'll be putting the Super Linton through its paces with music you'd read about on the NME, Rolling Stone and Pitchfork.
This episode is brought to you by Marantz, makers of the ISA award-winning Model M1 streaming amplifier. Click the link below for more info.
But before we start, how about Lou Reed's New York? Now, I have a working theory that music discovery stopped for most audiophiles in 1989, or at least I don't see much discussion about post-1989 music on the internet made by audiophiles. Anyway, Lou Reed's New York came out in, you guessed it, 1989. And this is Lou Reed's most critically acclaimed album. And perhaps that's because of the song's colourful characters and how the tunes are driven hard by dueling lead guitars, because you get one on the left channel and one in the right. But anyway, as you can probably tell, this is not the original pressing. This is the vinyl and CD box from 2020. It's a remaster, and I've been listening to this remastered version of New York through the Wharfedale Super Linton since August, and you can see the Super Linton behind me. Now, before the Monitor Audio Studio 89 went back to the manufacturer, I think in September, October, I conducted a side-by-side comparison with the Super Linton. Now, if you're new here, you need to know that I can only conduct side-by-side comparisons to gear that I have here at the time of review. Now, both the Monitor Audio and the Wharfedale are similarly, if not identically priced. So the Super Linton sell for €2,300 a pair with their matching stands, and those are the same stands that ship with the standard Linton. So you can store a small vinyl collection in the stand's undercarriage. Now, I would say that the Super Linton are more physical and less cerebral sounding than the Studio 89. And we get more of a sort of wall of sound, a bigger soundstage, both in terms of height and width, if not necessarily depth, from the Wharfedale than the Monitor Audio. Now, that might be because the Super Linton are more physically arresting, right? They have a greater bass reach and better dynamics, and that's probably because the Wharfedale is a three-way design working from a much larger cabinet than the Studio 89's two-way Diapolito driver array. That said, the Super Linton can't quite match the Monitor Audio on extracting music's finest details. And that could be because the Studio 89 uses an AMT tweeter and the Super Linton a dome. But this is not, and I gotta repeat, not a night and day difference. Nothing is getting destroyed here. And in the mid-range, any differences between the Super Linton and the Studio 89 are, I think, too close to call. So maybe the Wharfedale sounds a bit thicker and maybe the Monitor Audio sounds a little bit faster. Now, all of that was done with the Audiolab 9000A on amplifier duties and the Grimm MU2 acting as a Roon server, a Roon streamer and a DAC. Because the Grimm has an internal 8TB hard drive, which I have loaded with roughly, I think it's about 3.5 terabytes of FLAC files now. And it also runs custom software to work as a Roon core so that it effectively streams to itself. But technically, it's not Roon ready yet. Anyway, I put the cover art on my TV using a third-party Apple TV app, an Apple TV app called TV Remote. And for this review, I used music stashed in a Tidal playlist and then played that out via Roon on the Grimm MU2. And that playlist features the likes of Death Cab for Cutie, The Cure, Bright Eyes, Geordie Greep, Smog, Banco de Gaia, PJ Harvey, Robert Liner and The Microphones. And if you're not familiar with any of those artists. Know that only 2 of them make electronic music. Anyway, I would like to thank Roon for sponsoring this video. Now, before we can compare the Super Linton to the original Linton, or rather the one from 2019, we need to know how they differ from a design perspective. And who better to ask about the upgrades than the man who designed them both, Peter Comeau.
Now, Wharfedale actually had a Super Linton in the early days, which was just a larger cabinet, didn't have anything else different about it, but it did give more bass response. So that's where we wanted to start. We thought, how can we improve the bass response of Linton? So we started with a brand new motor system, a very advanced motor system with much more magnet power, more advanced voice coil and copper clad pole piece in order to give us more drive, more transient attack. And then we found that the specifications of that bass unit demanded a larger volume inside the cabinet. So we increased the height of the cabinet by 50 millimeters to give us that extra volume. And that also gives us further bass extension down to 30 hertz in room. Now, having done that, it seemed to me pointless to leave the mid-range and treble alone. We needed really to upgrade everything in order to bring it in line with the improved performance of the bass unit. So the mid-range unit, we didn't actually have to do any improvements to the unit itself. However, we did look at the cavity that it's in and improve the damping behind the mid-range unit so that we got more of a transmission line, more absorption of that rear energy coming out from the cones so that it didn't reflect back through the cone. And then finally the treble circuit, which is where a lot of people were asking for improvements in resolution and detailing. We used a version of the treble unit that we'd previously designed for the Dovedale and put that one in there. And then to go with that, again, crossover improvements, which align it much better now with the mid-range and bass unit and really give a seamless performance. The other improvements we made are to the components we've used. We've used low inductance resistors throughout. We've used the highest grade polypropylene capacitors that we can find for a commercial loudspeaker without breaking the bank, obviously. And finally, the cabinet, of course. The cabinet is now dual layer, so has a layer of chipboard and a layer of MDF coupled together with a damping layer of glue. And that gives us very low coloration from the cabinet. We've also used a mixture of acoustic foam in critical areas on the panels of the internal of the cabinet, which gives us an improved absorption of sound from inside the cabinet. So we've got a combination of acoustic foam and acoustic fibre where necessary. I adjust the balance to give me the best listening performance.
So that video was shot in Munich in May of this year, and so essentially the Super Linton gives us a taller, thicker walled cabinet. It gives us a more powerful bass driver motor. The driver's the same but the motor's different. And then Comeau has added backwave absorption to the mid-range driver, and the new tweeter was pulled from the Dovedale. And there's a completely reworked crossover that now spans 2 boards instead of 1. Now, more recently, I asked Peter Comeau for frequency response plots of both models. And from his measurements, we can deduce that the Super Linton has an extra few dB of sensitivity. So that means it will play slightly louder than the Linton given the same input signal. And Comeau also told me via email that we should note from the frequency response plots that the Super Linton has better damped bass. And this allows users to place the speakers closer to the front wall. Now, despite that being Comeau's assertion and not mine, it does sound like a win for anyone listening in a smaller room. And I'll have more to say about that shortly. But our man from Wharfedale also confirmed that, like the Linton, the Super Linton should be heard with grills on, because those grills are reportedly designed to reduce the cabinet's edge diffraction. But then came a warning, because Comeau said that he wouldn't really read too much into his frequency response graph, because what we hear from the Super Linton is the sum of a lot of very different aspects. So even a measurement noob like me can see that the graph does not show the speaker's off-axis responses that would otherwise speak to how they might sound in an untreated room. And according to Comeau, the graph doesn't show the new crossover's better driver integration and its improved phase response. So that's what Peter Comeau tells us from an engineering point of view. What do I hear in my acoustically treated listening room here in Berlin? So yeah, it's time for a side-by-side comparison, the Linton versus the Super Linton. So from the newcomer, we get a crisper, cleaner treble. On Death Cab for Cuties, we looked like giants. Now that's a brighter indie rock recording from the mid-noughties that I think fares better in Linton hands. And then pulling up Radiohead's Jigsaw falling into place, we also know a slightly keener presence region from the Super Linton. And the dead-eyed country of Smog's I Was a Stranger, you've got to hear this track, it's fantastic, even audiophiles will like this track. That tells us that the Super's mid-range edges out the Linton on clarity. And we get punchier low bass from the Super than the Linton on Varga's WQ2, which is a hearty recommendation for anyone even remotely interested in the sound of basic channel. But that's a sign to all of us that a sub really won't be needed with the Super Linton in all but the largest of rooms. But then there's the Super's more spirited transient snap, as heard on the Cure's primary. Now they're not as dynamic as the Zoo DWX or as nimble on their feet as the KEF Q Concerto Meta, but they are still better than the Linton in this regard. Another Super Linton highlight for me is how they precisely show us where instruments sit in the phantom center that is drawn between the loudspeakers, right? The stereo effect. Now, sometimes this is called sound staging, other times it's called imaging. Today, I'm going to call it player localization, because that's a term that I've nabbed from Srajan at 6 Moons. And to hear how the Super Linton are better with player localization, I listened to PJ Harvey's actually slightly disappointing cover of Joy Division's Love Will Tear Us Apart, and then Geordie Greep's tightly wound Holy Holy, which is just superb, but it's gonna divide a room, that track, it really is. So I hear the Super Linton as more dynamic, more detailed, and more precise with imaging than the Linton. But these are not OMG, night and day, this destroys that difference, because that would be absurd. But one of the reasons I really like the Linton, the original Linton, in my larger Portugal room is because I can turn the volume knob further to get the dynamics and the detail that I really want. In other words, I can play them louder because it's a slightly bigger room from an acoustic point of view. And I can't do that here in Berlin because this room is smaller, even though the reverb in here is much lower. But crucially, the Super Linton Don't force my volume turning hand as much as the Linton. Why not? Well, because they are more naturally dynamic and more naturally extended at both ends of the frequency range, and they sound fuller and more expressive than the Linton at lower volumes. So is the Super Linton the best sounding Linton? I would say so, yes. But if we ask if it's the best value Linton, I would say no, because I still think the best value Linton is the original one, not the 60s one, the 2019 one, right? And I also think the original Linton is the most generous of the two, with lesser quality source components and poorer recordings. So whether you'll spring the extra $1,000 or so for the Super Linton will depend on three things. Number one, how much you want to hear more of what's going on upstream in your hi-fi system. Number two, your relationship to $1,000 and how readily you can earn it. And number three, your ties to hi-fi and how much of a priority it holds in your life. So let's not forget, right, that when people comment, that's far too expensive, or that's not worth the extra, they aren't speaking for everyone. They are speaking for themselves. We should read "that's too expensive" as "that's too expensive for me." And when someone says "that's not worth the extra," what they're actually saying is "that's not worth the extra to me." Anyway, if you like this video, you know what to do. And if you dig my sometimes irreverent attitude to hi-fi, then please consider joining me on Patreon, where you'll find playlists for this video and every other video we've made since 2020. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Oh, and I have three more thoughts. Number one, after initially using the Audiolab 9000A to drive the Super Linton, I cut over to the recently reborn Quad 33 and 303, and then later I moved to the Luxman L-505Z. And I'll have more to say about those amplifiers in my upcoming quad video. Number two, no, I didn't compare the Super Linton to any speakers other than those featured in this video. And number three, the main reason I do side-by-side comparisons nowadays is to tease out the audible characteristics of the product at hand, the subject of the video.